Growing up in a lower middle class family, I never had the privilege of relying on a car or booking a cab whenever I needed to travel. Therefore, my only option was to use public transportation. As many of you may relate, it can sometimes be daunting and dangerous. The presence of some creepy individuals can make for an unsettling experience and leave one feeling uneasy throughout the journey. This is about when I was still attending university, and by that, I mean I was still going through that typical phase most teenagers go through. I'm cringing even imagining my choice of attire that I used to wear back then. To put it mildly, I combined gothic and bohemian styles in a poorly executed manner. Trust me, I've locked away all my old pictures from that time in a chest and buried them underground. Additionally, I was part of an electric band with a group of guys. However, I can't quite recall my role in the band. All I did during those band sessions was party and make out with my boyfriend, Matt, who was also part of the band. My parents were usually at work, so I often sneaked out of the house, took a bus, went to Matt, and hung out with him. It was mainly because he came from a wealthy family and paid for everything. Despite encountering a few creepy people here and there, nothing quite shook me like this particular experience. That day, I decided to take a bus to my boyfriend's garage, where he used to practice for his band after school instead of going home thinking of surprising him. Instead, I was the one who was surprised when I got there when my eyes landed on the most disturbing sight. His tongue inside a hot blonde's, I can't even say where. I got so furious that I wanted to grab the guitar leaning on the wall beside them and smash it on his head, but I controlled that urge and quietly walked away. I sat there, lost in thought, at the bus stop as several buses drove by, regretting the years I had spent with him and feeling sad. The area wasn't too busy or deserted, with many people around. I probably sat there for about an hour until my mom called and asked why I hadn't returned home yet. I waited to board the next bus after telling my mom I was on my way. Little did I know that an individual with nefarious intentions closely monitored my every move. As I got on the bus, I couldn't help but notice that it was pretty empty. Only 4 to 5 people were on board. Maybe it was just because of my depressed mind, and I know it was rude of me to assume that, but every one of them seemed a bit sketchy for some reason. The journey from that stop to my house was approximately 30 minutes. Given the events with my boyfriend and all, I wasn't ready for any scary encounters, but unfortunately, life doesn't always go as you wish it would. As I sat on an empty window seat, minding my business, a middle-aged man who boarded the bus right after me approached and sat beside me. I couldn't help but notice the stark difference in our heights. He was noticeably shorter than me, standing at around 5'3". You could tell that his unkempt, yellowish blonde hair hadn't been washed in days. Even though plenty of empty seats were available, I couldn't understand why this grown man had chosen to sit next to me, a teenage girl. My intuition alerted me that something was off about him, and I couldn't shake the sensation of discomfort. So, I made it evident that I was uncomfortable by purposely scanning the bus with my head, turning around, hoping he would get the hint and move to another seat. But he didn't budge. Instead, he gave me a weird smile. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. I felt he was going to say something, for I could feel his gaze fixated on me. So I extracted my earphones from my bag, shoved them in my ears, and played any song on the top of my playlist at full volume. A few minutes passed, and I swear he was still looking at me, and it wasn't my face he stared at. Though I tried my best to avoid it, I still felt crept out to the point where I forgot all about Matt and his tongue session. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and I jolted my head toward the guy as I felt him squeezing my thigh. His eyes were closed, and his other hand was on his bulge, which disgusted me. I slapped his hand away as I stood up, shouting, "Keep your hands to yourself, mister." It made everyone on the bus look in our direction. I went to a different seat, closer to the door, and sat on the outer side to prevent him from sitting beside me. My heart was thumping loudly, and I was terrified of everything. But since my stop was approaching, I held myself from crying, even though I was scared that he would get off at the same stop and do something to me. The bus stopped at my stop, and I saw the man standing up after me. So I immediately told the driver in a loud voice with my eyes filled with tears to not let that man get off after me because he was trying to touch me indecently. The driver looked at me hesitantly for a few seconds before nodding. I rushed out of the bus, and the driver kept his word, for he drove off the moment I stepped out. I couldn't stop the tears streaming down my eyes as I walked to the house. When I got home, I found my mom waiting for me. She looked at my swollen eyes and asked worriedly about what happened. I didn't mention the horrifying encounter since I knew she would stop me from going anywhere other than school. I told her about Matt cheating on me, though, and trust me, she was furious, ready to throw him some punches. It's not like I never met with creepy individuals again. I sure did, but it was nothing in comparison to that incident. I'm still shaken up from that memory because of the trauma it gave me. It made me start carrying multiple pepper sprays with me everywhere, and if I had the money, I would have taken self-defense classes too. About Matt, he did try to contact me several times, but I blocked him. I wouldn't say I became a good girl who started focusing on my studies, but I did stop hanging out with every bad influence I thought there was.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. Some of you guys have probably seen one of those members of high school or middle school bands, so you might have an idea about how these bands sometimes give off a cult vibe. No, seriously, I don't know about the rest of you, but I used to think in middle school that the members of my band belonged to some sort of cult society, and this is not exaggerating it. To top it off, I was in the choir band where each member felt in their world. It was as if they were cosplaying the instrument they played. Now that I think about it, that was quite impressive to stay in character in each of our practice sessions, but at the time, I used to get annoyed with it. Well, it might be partially for being the trumpet player. No, there was this one kid, Lucas, who used to get into the role way too much and bossed others around like a leader despite not being one. And then there were kids like me and Alan who would always end up in an argument with him. There were around 15 or 20 kids in the band, so it wasn't a problem for us to stand up, because we would always find someone having a similar problem with him. And there were times when we thought Lucas kept giving the two of us murderous looks, but we were blatant about it and we would laugh it off while saying that he must be thinking he was so tough since his father was on the school committee. We often had to compete against other choirs or bands, so there was always practice on the go. And that time we were preparing for a competition as well when this incident took place. It all started when Luca pushed Alan, who was my only best friend in the school. In my opinion, he was jealous of our friendship since he wasn't capable of making such a bond with others. For heaven's sake, all this boy knew was to torment others and be a pain in the head. Now that day, the choir of the band came up with the flu, so without holding an audition, the choir director gave the position to Lucas without telling us that we did not have enough time to hold an audition. Fair enough, it was all good. Us practicing at our pace, the rest of the members still giving off cult member vibes to us, until Lucas suddenly stopped in the middle of practice, turned to us, and started yelling for going off beat. I mean, how he could say it was us when he was the front man. It could have been any of the 20 members. I still don't get why none of them ever stopped him from pushing others around. What were they so afraid of? His father? Hell, he could have said anything if they were to stand up for the unfairness that kid was spreading across. Still, everyone stood silently as he called Alan in the front, only to start pushing him in a rude, aggressive manner. The reason he didn't behave that way to me was because I had insulted him a few times in front of others, so he might have wanted to save face. But looking at the way he was behaving with my best friend, I started to think otherwise. I watched a few pushes while Alan kept saying it wasn't him who fell off beat, and he wanted no trouble. But the moment his last push made him stumble and fall, I had it. I leaped toward him from my position and hit his hand with the trumpet I had. For some reason, I was beyond mad at that point. There was always this protective feeling inside me for the people I cared about, and watching them get hurt was unimaginable. Guess that emotion took over as I continuously hit him with the trumpet while he groaned and whimpered with pain. Trust me when I say this, but none of the members came forward to stop me or help him. Guess these kids didn't care about their surroundings. Something makes me wonder if they were dead inside for some reason. Probably because their parents or some teacher forced them to join the choir band. Anyway, I was stopped by a teacher who heard from a passing student about the things going on in the music room. Luckily, I didn't do too much damage to his body besides his fractured hand, which was the result of continuously hitting by a 2.5-pound instrument. He was taken to the hospital immediately, while I was taken to the principal's office for questioning like some sort of criminal. Well, looking at what I had just done, I wouldn't say otherwise. My parents were called immediately to inform them about their son's activities, along with a week's suspension letter in my hand. And if that wasn't enough, they grounded me as well by taking away my access to games, my cell phone, and my monthly allowance. By now, I was officially off the band, and I didn't care either, since I had already decided that I was going to form a rock band in high school with my only best friend. No, the story doesn't end just yet. After spending an entire week at home reflecting on my actions as per my parents' command, it was finally the day when I had to go back to school. I wasn't able to get in touch with Alan all week due to my phone being taken, so I was eager to meet him and ask about what was going on for the past few days in school. The moment I entered the classroom, I was taken back by the anonymous turn of events as the shithead Lucas, who was wearing a cast now, was laughing with Alan, and they were seatmates now. What the hell? That's what I thought striding toward them. My traitor friend's eyes met mine for a second, but he looked away, avoiding my gaze full of anger. Before I could say anything, he got up and walked out of the classroom, which I understood as a signal for me to follow him. What in the world do you think you're doing with him? Are you two like buddies now? I grabbed him by the collar as I asked the second I walked out of the classroom. Sebastian, you know that my dad is also a council member, right? His father has more influence than him, so they could kick him out if I didn't stop hanging out with you. The moment he uttered those words, I felt dumbstruck. I was in this situation because of this guy, and he was leaving me behind now that I was in the problem. To hell with our friendship and everything. The grip tightened on his collar as I felt the urge to punch him in his damn face, but then I heard the homeroom teacher. Sebastian, get off him this instant. This is your last warning. One hit to any other student and you will be expelled. I loosened my grip and walked away to the classroom, locking all the thoughts in a box and putting them away in the back of my mind. The rest of the middle school period went just like that, without me trying to make another friend. And it was better this way since I got into no problem like that. Lucas went back to being a jerk to Alan after a few days. Turned out the only reason he was being nice was because of my beating, but I didn't talk to him after that. I wasn't the type to forgive backstabbers. Doesn't matter if he was my best friend.
So when I was in high school, it was my senior year. I was 5'3", about 95 pounds. I was at the park down the street from my house waiting for the school bus. Usually my boyfriend, who was already graduated, would drive me to school, but he was busy. I later found out that he was cheating. Well, there was usually a few of us girls there waiting, but this day I was the only one. So I sat at a bench and had one headphone in and one out so I could listen to my surroundings. I've always been cautious of what's going on around me. As I waited, a black Honda pulled up and I immediately noticed it. I kept an eye on it because I had a bad feeling about it. I wasn't making it obvious that I was watching it because I didn't want to look crazy, but after a few minutes, 2 big men got out. I immediately texted my boyfriend that I was at the park and these guys were creeping me out. Of course he didn't text back, so I copy-pasted the same text to my cousin, who was home. I live with my aunt and 2 guy cousins, unwinding down from the night shift. I wanted someone to know the car make and color, plus it was 2 men, and didn't get any responses. When they got out of the car, they started to walk towards me, so I got up from the bench and walked towards the street because the bus was supposed to be there any minute. The driver actually ended up being a little late. As I stood by the street, these men walked up to me and I could feel the bad energy. One guy said hello as the others stood there staring me down. I just did a small smile and a nod, then looked away. Then the same guy, I'll call him number 1, asked how old I was. I didn't respond. I could tell the other guy, number 2, was getting mad that I wasn't feeding into it. Then number 1 kept asking me yes or no questions like, do you have a boyfriend? Do you live close? Do you do drugs? We have some. Do you want some? And then number 2 asked me if I knew what the black market was. I felt a cold rush go over my body and I got the chills. Number 2, who was quiet the whole time, started to tell me how they just got back from Russia, but the way he said it was so scary, also intimidating. I knew they were from somewhere else because they had a strong accent, but I couldn't pinpoint the place. They kept telling me to go to their car because they have drugs. I said no thank you. Trust me, I wasn't a straight edge in high school, but I wasn't stupid either. I would never get into somebody's car that I didn't know. Then number 1 asked if I had a car. I said no and that my bus is almost here, sorry I have to go. And by some sort of miracle, the bus rounded the corner and the guys backed off. They had been inching closer and closer as they asked me questions, but before the bus got to me, number 1 handed me a card and said that he has a car shop and to call him sometime if I ever need anything. He even stated that he'd give me a free car. The card looked shifty and I didn't want to grab it, but I knew I needed that number on it to report it. So I took it and they walked off super fast. Finally, the bus stopped and picked me up. As soon as I got on, I started to cry. I had a complete meltdown. It was like all the adrenaline was keeping my mind and body aware and focused while the men were there, but as soon as I was safe, my body and mind gave out. Thankfully, there weren't many people on the bus, so the driver calmed me down before we took off and I explained to her what had happened. When she looked around for the car, they were gone. She said she saw them around me, but thought I knew them because they were so close to my person. The driver called into her dispatch saying that there was an incident so that they could notify the school. She continued to pick all the other students up, but when we got to the school, she walked me into the office. I was absolutely terrified to be alone. The principal came out and so did campus security. They were so sweet and gentle with me as they brought me back to the principal's office. Both were men and they proceeded to ask me questions about the men, the car, and the questions the creeps had asked me. I cried the whole time. Then I pulled out the card that they gave me and handed it to the principal. He looked at the security and said that he was going to call it and act like my dad, so we did. He was on speaker and the number 1 guy actually answered. I knew his voice as if though it were burned into my brain. It took everything in me not to have a panic attack. The principal asked the guy if he could get him a car at a good price and the guy played dumb. The principal said his daughter, me, gave him the card. As soon as he said that, the guy hung up. They tried calling again and the phone was shut off. They eventually disconnected. I could see a shift in the principal and security as soon as the phone clicked. The security got on his phone and called the police and had them come to the school. It was as if they finally knew it was real, like my crazy story wasn't made up. The principal excused himself and the security guard and they talked for a minute in the hall. I could hear everything they were saying. She's lucky to be alive. This is serious. We need to call her parents to come get her. When the police got there, they came into the office that I was sitting in and asked me for the story again and in front of the principal and security guard. I feel like they wanted to see if I was being 100% honest, so I obliged. The officers were straight up with me and told me it sounded like they were watching us girls at that park because They chose the one day that one of us were alone. He also said the card was being used as bait to get me to go where they wanted. I felt sick. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The school called my aunt, but she didn't pick up. The only person that picked up first was my boyfriend. One of the officers talked to him as the other finally got a hold of my aunt. My boyfriend ended up picking me up and taking me home, and I cried the whole time. When I got there, my grandma, uncle, aunt, mom, and cousins were all out front. The women were all in tears, and the men were livid but worried for me. A week later, some girl at another local high school, not far from the park, was saved by other students. She was being dragged into a black Honda by two guys. The other kids stood up and grabbed her and pulled her out of the car. The principal called me into his office, and that's how I found out. They also had the same officers there and had me choose the two guys out of a picture lineup. I pointed them out fast. They were caught. It was in fact those two guys that tried grabbing the girl, a freshman girl. I felt worried for her and sad that she went through worse than I did, and I felt almost free again. Still scared, but not looking over my shoulders as often, and I couldn't believe that they were caught. After that, my family teamed up to drive me to school for the rest of the year. My boyfriend, now ex, also took me some days. I'm thankful to be alive and well, and I'm even more thankful that the girl was also saved by the courageous kids at her high school.
Juzo Itami was a Japanese film director born in the city of Kyoto on May 15, 1933. From an early age, Juzo's profound intelligence and natural talent was obvious to the adults around him, and towards the end of World War II, educational authorities local to Kyoto selected him as a designated prodigy. This meant he was transferred to the Togobetsu Kagoku Kakyo, part of a government program to foster academic genius. The goal of this class was to reduce scientists capable of inventing and engineering superweapons that would be used to defeat the Allied powers. Essentially, the Japanese government wished to create a class of evil geniuses, and Juzo was one of them. But thankfully, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the world to an end, and the special scientific education classes were eventually dissolved in March of 1947. Yet, as he grew older, Juzo have found himself growing less and less interested in science, and increasingly drawn to the medium of cinema. He started his career as an actor in the 1960s, Genzan no Dora Neko, but quickly found himself much more comfortable behind the camera. Going on to direct the 1984 hit comedy The Funeral, his movies became something of a phenomenon in the late 20th century Japan, and were lauded as being funny and insightful. While remaining delightfully subtle, they often told stories that were central to the Japanese character, culture, and way of thinking, such as 1985's Tampopo, which tells the tale of a woman who set out to make the perfect noodle. But after establishing himself as Japan's premier comedic film producer, Juzo turned his attention to more serious subject matter. In 1992, Juzo held a mirror up to Japanese society when he made the film Minbar, a satire which poked fun at the traditional Japanese crime families known collectively as the Yakuza. The name Yakuza comes from a traditional Japanese card game known as Old Oishikubo. Is a game where the aim is to draw 3 cards which add to a total score of 9. The rules of the game are fairly complex, but the worst possible 3 cards to draw are 8, 9, and 3, pronounced Yaku-za in Japanese. The implication being that if you're in a situation where you're dealing with the Yakuza, you're in the worst situation possible. In the film, Mendo Jusa wrote that Yakuza as being big dumb bullies with a ridiculous dress sense and a perverse set of morals. A set of morals which they believe made them as appearing as chivalrous samurai, but actually made them look archaic and foolish. The film culminates in the Yakuza family and Question being completely outwitted by a timid, but intelligent female attorney, played by Jesus' wife, Nobuko Miyamoto. The film meant a national laughingstock of the much-feared Yakuza and sparked off something of the judicial revolution in which the police stepped up their persecutions of Yakuza members, while media outlets began to refer to them as a boryokodon, a disrespectful term meaning violent gangs. Naturally, Yakuza clans all over Japan were thoroughly outraged by the humiliating depiction of them, and some even sought direct revenge against Jews. Then, on May 22, 1992, less than a week after the film's initial release in theaters, Juzo was accosted by several members of the Gotogumi, a Shizuoka-based Yakuza clan, who demanded he apologize for the offense that it caused. However, instead of groveling, Juzo was defiant in the face of their threats and refused to be intimidated. The Yakuza then attacked, beating him senseless before slashing his face and shoulder with a traditional Japanese sword known as the wakizashi, one that is similar in design, but not nearly as big as a katana. Used for close-quarter fighting to behead a defeated opponent, and sometimes to commit seppuku, a form of ritually ending their own life. The brutal attack left Juzo with a large scar on his left cheek, one that would become a symbol of his rebellious defiance, and made the director instantly recognizable when in public, as the attack quickly became national news. As you might expect, the attack didn't silence Juzo, and he went on to become a hugely vocal critic of the Yakuza, says flagrant disrespect for Japanese laws and society. The attack on him by the Gotogumi only caused the Japanese government and police to intensify their crackdown on the Yakuza, and a series of high-profile raids saw several 100 Yakuza arrested and charged with offenses ranging from murder and extortion to tax evasion. For the next 5 years, judo was a thorn in the Yakuza side, and it reached the point where several rival Yakuza families actually put their differences aside and met to discuss a permanent solution to the problematic celebrity nemesis. Then, on December 20th, 1997, but then 64-year-old director was found dead just outside of his home after apparently jumping off an 8-story roof in what was deemed to be a tragic event of him taking his own life. A popular Japanese celebrity gossip magazine had recently published an article alleging that Juzo was having a secret affair with a much younger actress with whom he had worked with on several occasions. Juzo denied the accusations in his notes that he had left and wrote that he would prove his innocence in a grand display of protest by taking his own life. This was viewed by some as highly suspicious, and although Japanese homicide detectives puzzled over the circumstances, it wasn't entirely unlike Juzo to react so passionately to a perceived injustice. However, and an interesting turn of events, Juzo, his wife, Nobuko Miyamoto, was subsequently placed under police protection, apparently to keep her safe from the Yakuza. But just why should she require police protection after her husband taking her own life was a mystery that would only be solved after an investigation by an American journalist. Jake Aldestein grew up in Columbia, Missouri, but moved to Japan at the tender age of 19 to study Japanese literature at Sophia University, one of the country's top private colleges. In 1993, Adelstein became the first non-Japanese staff writer at the Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper, where he worked for 12 years. After leaving the Yomiuri, that Ustein published a series of articles on how you can use a bus to Damasgoto, made a deal with the FBI to inform on Yakuza incursions into the US, in exchange for a liver transplant at the University of California, Los Angeles. In 2019, Adelstein published a memoir about his career as a reporter in Japan, Tokyo, Vice, in which he accosts Goto of threatening to kill him over the story. It was a shocking exposure of just how deep the Yakuza influence still ran in Japanese society. In one part of the memoir, proved to be a terrifying insight on just how much they hated director Juzo Itami. An anonymous source told Adelstein that Dadi Masagoto, the same Yakuza boss who had ordered that scarring attack on Juzo in 1992, had visited him on the day of him apparently taking his life and ordered him to the roof of the building at gunpoint. He then gave Juzo a choice: jump from the 8-story building and give himself a slim chance of survival, or receive a bullet to the brain, which he most definitely would not recover from. According to the source, Juzo chose the former and leapt from the roof, unfortunately dying as a result of his injuries. In the aftermath, the Gotogumi clan faked the note from Juzo, then leaked a false rumor to Japanese tabloids detailing the alleged affair that was referenced in the bogus note. It was the perfect murder, as there appeared to be no foul play whatsoever and no proof that Juzo had been forced from the rooftop as opposed to jumping voluntarily as a result, and no one has ever been charged with his murder. And the Gotogumi clan has apparently gotten away with the murder of one of their greatest nemesis, not by being brutal enough to actually murder him, but by being devious enough to make him and his own life